Happy New Year. I hope that this video finds you well and that you had a beautiful, restorative Christmas time with your family. I wanted to make a video because a lot has been happening in the news lately, and a lot of important cultural trends, I think, need to be analyzed and woven together in a way that I haven't seen happening. So I'm going to try and offer my perspective to the public square in terms of what's going on lately with immigration and with discussions surrounding multiculturalism and culture and some of the internal debates within traditional spheres. So let's dive in. I am happy, maybe isn't the right word. I am relieved and equally frustrated that the Rotherham grooming and sexual torture gangs have finally come into the public lexicon. And this has happened largely because Elon Musk has taken an interest in the topic. So thank God for that. I believe that I was trying to think back, reflect back, but I believe that I first learned about these gangs. And for people who don't yet know about them, they are Pakistani Muslim gangs that have operated in the United Kingdom in various cities across England, dating back to the 1970s, but increasing in prevalence from the 1980s onward. And what happened was that these Pakistani men, adult men, would isolate, groom, and identify vulnerable girls, usually from troubled backgrounds, and then they would charm them, ply them, drug them, get them drunk, and then sexually torture them, gang rape them, traffic them, and abuse them in horrific ways, sometimes for years. The scandal arose because across many levels of authority, people covered up the abuse of these white girls. These girls were targeted because they were white and were perceived as slags, which is a disgusting colloquial word in the United Kingdom, especially when it's directed at children. But they were perceived this way by these men from backwards places with backgrounds that do not align with English values or the civilized world. Now, the reason that this was covered up was twofold. The gangs operated in a fairly organized way. There would be taxi drivers who would pick the girls up. There would be realtors who would locate empty buildings where the gang rapes could occur, social workers who could identify at-risk girls who would be likely to be more easily manipulated. There were Pakistanis on city councils, politicians, police officers, all worked in concert to help cover it up. But the other aspect of this disgusting abuse scandal that's important to note is that there were also white people who were covering it up. It wasn't just a question of in-group preference of the most backwards people. It was also people who ought to have known better, who were tasked with protecting children, police officers, politicians, social workers. There were whistleblowers. There were whistleblowers, women who worked very hard to try and bring this abuse scandal to light. And one of them I know was sent to, a DEI basically training camp. I don't know what they're called. Communist struggle session, for her complaints about little white girls being sexually tortured and trafficked. So there were also prominent activists and writers who took an interest in this. And I believe that I first learned about the situation through the writing of Mark Steyn, the GOAT of all opinion writers, one of my favorite writers ever, in reading about it. And I was astonished. I found it almost impossible to understand how this wasn't being covered in the mainstream press, except by Mark Steyn, because he was, at the time, I believe he was writing for some pretty big newspapers. There was also the activist and journalist Tommy Robinson, who worked tirelessly to try to bring this to the forefront. And then, of course, there were others as well. They were by no means alone, but they were the two people who I know of who brought the situation to light. So it's very good that it is now being exposed and it's breaking into the mainstream and people are telling the truth, and they're no longer using euphemisms like Asian for overwhelmingly Pakistani Muslims and pretending that this happened to all sorts of girls when the girls who were targeted were overwhelmingly white. Were all of the perpetrators Pakistani Muslims? No, of course not. Were all of the victims white girls? No, of course not. But we're dealing with majorities, and exceptions do not make a rule. So it is good that people are telling the truth finally. But what are some of the broader problems that have to be contended with in terms of this story? It's not just the institutional cover-up. It is not just the degradation and breakdown of the British culture to the point where they would value something as nebulous as multiculturalism over protecting little girls. It's astonishing to speak the words out loud, but that's basically what it boiled down to. Protecting an abstraction like multiculturalism when you have a very clear example of why multiculturalism is not working. And that is held to higher esteem than girls, some of whom were murdered. One of the girls, I'm going to pause and I'm going to look up her name because she deserves it. I'm going to refer to some of my notes because I don't want to get this wrong. So one of the girls was named Charlene Downs. She was 14 years old when she disappeared in 2003. And in 2007, prosecutors argued in court that her body had been, sorry, this is hard to get through, her body had been minced into kebab meat, and her bones were crushed to make into a product for tiling. She was murdered and dismembered at a kebab shop after being a victim of child sexual exploitation for a long period of time. And unfortunately, the case, Charlene's case, fell apart, and the men were not brought to justice who did this to her. So the acts were horrific. Some of the girls were doused with gasoline and threatened to be burned alive. Some were branded. I'm not going to discuss the sexual torture because I won't be able to make it through it. And I think it's better in some ways for people not to know these details because it takes away part of our humanity when we learn these facts. So the degree of depravity is horrific. Yet we still have useful idiots and fake feminists who are coming out swinging for the Asian community because their concern is a reaction of Islamophobia as opposed to protecting little girls from being sexually tortured and murdered. It really is a new immoral low. So that came out in the news shortly after a Christmas controversy. I was not wanting to jump into it at the time because Christmas, I'm a Christian. It's in a very joyful and important time of year where the focus should be on family, in my opinion. And at this time, unfortunately, the tech bros decided that it would make a lot of sense to come out in favor of immigration with an emphasis on the H-1B program. In response to this take, which was very poorly received by the MAGA base, because the MAGA base is not only against the mass invasion, they are also opposed to large numbers of legal immigration coming in. I think that that was fairly clear. It is eroding the American social fabric. It is causing problems in terms of Americans not having employment opportunities that they deserve to have in their own country. And I think a lot of MAGA, I'm not American, but I think a lot of MAGA Americans believe that their country does not belong to other people to give away. In particular, people who are immigrants themselves, like Elon Musk, or Vivek Ramaswamy, who is a first generation. There is a certain hierarchy, I think, in the American mind, even though they're very open people, where there's an expectation of people who are welcomed into their country to put their time in before they start to advocate to give the country away to other foreigners. I think that that's fair. I think that that is moral, and I think that it's reasonable. So it's important, I think, to emphasize that a lot of the confusion, in my opinion, surrounding the debate on culture and immigration and on nation states and Western civilization in the West, centers around a framing of immigration as an economic question exclusively. I think that the left, progressives, communists, whatever you want to call them, have done a very good job of selling the idea of multiculturalism as being a moral virtue. And they have done a very good job of marketing immigration as strictly a question of economics. And so this ends up pigeonholing people into a discussion where they are debating with spreadsheet nerds about the virtues of immigration rather than taking a holistic approach to the topic where the economic impacts are merely one aspect of immigration, because in actuality, the economic impacts are merely one aspect of immigration. My argument is that culture is far more important than the economy, and in fact underpins the economy and good economic outcomes. And that if we disregard culture, we are certain to have negative economic impacts. And if we disregard culture, we don't have a country at all. A country is not merely an economic zone. A country is not an economic zone for industrialists and for parasites. That's not what a country is. That is not enough to sustain a people. That is not enough to motivate a people to build healthy communities, healthy families, and to feel that they have skin in the game for accomplishing their hopes and their dreams and for leaving something to their children. It is very demotivating to know that voting becomes a question of getting the least worst people in, and that the managerial regime is an enemy of the people and is facilitating parasitic behavior of the managerial elites, where they can bounce from one country to the next. Their passport is utterly meaningless to them. They will move on to the next opportunity, and that people who don't have this kind of freedom of movement are stuck in the ashes of what is left behind from people who feel no connection to any one particular place, citizens of the world, globalists, if you will. I think that's very demotivating. I also think that when people are engaging in the economic argument, that it is important for it to be framed properly, and the argument is oftentimes hinging with people who are pro-immigration onto economic arguments. The first one is the population is tanking in the West, therefore we need to bring foreigners in to replace the local populations because the birth rate has plummeted. So let's address that first argument. We have systemic problems underlying our economy. We have a currency that is not tied to anything. And we have governments that can borrow astronomical amounts of money, creating an inflationary economy. And they can tax citizens as much as they please, which is legislated theft. And all of the justifications for the taxing, the spending, and the money printing are based on propping up a socialist welfare state, which can only continue if it is paid for with Malthusian population growth, so exponential population growth. As ridiculous as it seems to many people now, there was a period of time in which economists believed that families would continue to get exponentially bigger. I don't know if anybody really thought about the fact that women can only have a finite number of babies, and that it is expensive to have babies, and that there was no possibility that this would ever continue over time. But socialists don't actually care if anything makes sense. They just do a very good job at selling people and getting them hooked and dependent on their horrendous anti-humanist projects. So we now have a massive welfare state in Canada. And the argument that people are making, the economic argument, is that we need to bring foreigners in to replace the tanking population, the lack of babies. But it's also an erroneous argument because we know that people who come in, even if they're wealthy and highly productive, as the case may be, bring in their family members who are aging, some of whom who haven't had proper medical care for their entire lives. They bring in dependents, and it gets very expensive very quickly. And whatever gains are contributed to the economy initially are offset by the massive costs associated with the family members of these people coming in. So it's an incorrect argument, the economic argument, for the reasons that I highlighted. But putting that aside, it's not the central reason why we should be opposed to mass immigration. We should be opposed to mass immigration because it destroys the social fabric of the countries that we live in. I listened to a podcast recently where Pierre Poilievre was a guest on the Jordan Peterson show, and he spent over an hour discussing Canada's future in purely economic terms. There was very little time devoted to discussions about culture. And it really goes to show that conservatives, for the most part, especially in Canada, Western and Northern Europe, have basically conceded the culture war. They don't even make the arguments anymore. There were a few minutes that I'm going to focus on where the discussion of immigration did come up, and I wanted to critique it People get very frustrated with me when I criticize Pierre Poilievre because they are understandably desperate after the absolute decimation of our country in 10 years under the Cuban dictator's government. However, we need to restore the country. There's nothing left to conserve. Because of incrementalism and the philosophy of conservatives of the past, there's a period of time where they called themselves progressive conservatives, and they were indeed progressives, because they oversaw the selling out of our manufacturing sector, shipping it off to China. They oversaw us engaging in a lot of supposedly economically beneficial free trade agreements, which did not benefit Canada in the way that they were sold to the Canadian people. And because we know from whistleblowers that the Conservatives, in addition to the Liberals and the NDP, have been compromised by foreign interference, dating back to Mulroney. For people who don't know, Mulroney became Prime Minister in the 1980s in Canada. So this foreign interference dates back almost 50 years across party lines. And Canadians are not holding anybody accountable. It's being memory holed like it hasn't happened. And it's problematic because it's Chinese interference, Iranian interference, Indian interference. Please don't freak out and start with the Khalistani. I'm not getting into the weeds on that topic. So we know that there's been foreign interference, likely also Russian interference in the government. To what degree, we don't know. There hasn't been a proper investigation yet. There's no public details that are being released. We are in the dark, and the traitors are still in our House of Commons. So it's absolutely shocking that this hasn't been front page news across the newspapers literally every day, all day long, and that the supposed Conservative MPs are not screaming from the rooftops about it. So putting that detail aside, in this podcast, what I wanted to get into in terms of immigration and culture was when Poilievre talked about the problem of mass immigration. He didn't say anything. I didn't hear the entire podcast. I listened to most of it, but from what I heard, there was no mention of the 5 million Canadians whose paperwork, not Canadians, sorry, foreigners, whose paperwork is going to expire within the next 12 months and who need to be shipped back to the backwards places that they come from. That's just basic survival. That isn't even getting into a question of culture. We have a housing crisis now because so many foreigners have been let in. Even the Liberals are trying to walk back their own immigration policies, which people like me were called a racist for criticizing. They themselves are now walking them back. Mark Miller posts about it most days, where he tries to distance himself from his own government's catastrophe that they foisted on Canadians. So we have those 5 million people who need to be deported. But we also have a huge number of people who are first generation Canadians or who are now legal citizens from other countries. And when Poilievre started to discuss this, he said, and I'm going to pause and refer to my notes again because I want to be precise and fair. Okay, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something along the lines of he wants to return Canada to the best immigration system in the world that we had for 150 years. Okay, but the thing is, for 150 years, we didn't have the same immigration system. That is farcical. Until the 1960s, Canada became a country in 1867, but arguably was a nation for hundreds of years before that. Canada became a nation state, properly Canada, BNA Act 1867. So from 1867 until the 1960s, when the Cuban dictator's stepfather, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, became the prime minister, the overwhelming majority of immigrants who came into Canada were Brits. there were increasing numbers of Western Europeans, but even that was controversial, and I'll get into that a little bit later. And then in the 1960s, Trudeau Sr. introduced the concept of multiculturalism, and he started to change our immigration to the point where people began to immigrate into Canada from countries where there had never been large numbers of immigrants coming into them from. But even at that point, there was still an emphasis on, British Commonwealth countries, so that, Indians who were coming in at that time, let's say from India, still had the British Commonwealth understanding of institutions, and many were highly educated and had overlapping values, and were able to integrate well. And there was also still, it's worth noting, even though the policy changed, Canada didn't change overnight and become a commie hellhole right away. In the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, up until the mid 1990s, most of the people who were working in the bureaucracy and in the managerial regime were still from a time in which there was sanity, there was a shared history. They were well educated. They knew the basics of Canadian civics. They had national pride. And so we were able to continue for decades, despite having horrific policies, which now have culminated in an existential crisis to the country. We were able to exist for a fairly long period of decades in spite of these bad policies. When people argue that the bad policies were good policies and then things suddenly got bad, they're not understanding that the policy of multiculturalism was never good. It was never one that would work. Throughout human history, societies which have endured have tended to be quite parochial and have aggressively and defensively perpetuated their traditions, their customs, their language, sometimes going to war over these issues, right? And that's not to say that empires like the Roman Empire were not, they did not impose completely from top to bottom the Roman way of life on all of their subjects. There was a bit of latitude there, but they did think that their own culture was superior, and they did expect a certain amount of adaptation of their subjects. So, that's a much broader discussion. But I would argue myself that part of the reason why people were able to assimilate was because there was pressure to assimilate. So even though the policy of multiculturalism was being crafted and applied socially, if people arrived from country X, let's take any kind of thought out of it, country X, and did things that were unpleasant or not in keeping with Canadian culture, there were very harsh social correctives at the time that helped people to integrate. So we can take race right out of the discussion, and I'd like to talk about another point that Poilievre mentioned. He said that Catholics and Protestants I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said that, everybody arrived in Canada and it was kumbaya. That is a complete misrepresentation of Canadian history. And it's important that people know our history, because then you know when you're being lied to. And you know when you're being sold silly BS. This is silly BS. I'm going to take the example simply of the Irish. In Canada, we know that we have most people maybe don't know if you're not Canadian. So we have the founding peoples were the French and the English, to a lesser degree the Scots, who had a tremendous impact in Canada, and then the Irish, the Welsh were smaller cultural influences. But the predominant founding fathers, if you will, were overwhelmingly British, and then there were some French Canadians as well. The reason why the British had a bigger impact was because they defeated the French and pretending that Protestants and Catholics were kumbaya is absurd. The French and the English fought one another for well over 700 years. And the wars that they had extended into the New World when they sent settlers to the New World. So in Canada, I'm not going to get into all of the different skirmishes dating back, but we can look at the Plains of Abraham, where the British defeated the French in Quebec City, and then the British defeated the French in Montreal. The French and the British were fighting in all across Canada, but they were also fighting in Europe, and they were fighting in other spots in the Americas. So this was part of the 7 Years' War, and hundreds of thousands of Brits and hundreds of thousands of Frenchmen died fighting each other. So the English, the Brits, ultimately prevailed, won. The French gave them their colony in Canada. And so the British, after so many hundreds of years of fighting with the French, decided that to have a lasting peace, they would compromise and permit the French to retain the Napoleonic laws, which were the civil law. So we have common law in the rest of Canada and civil law in Quebec, and their language. So most of the institutions still were based on the British system, certainly federally, and this worked fairly well. Then we had the communists come into power. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he decided that there would be official bilingualism, which meant that the Canadian government would be staffed primarily by Quebecers because they were more likely to be bilingual than Canadians from elsewhere. And it changed a lot in terms of the culture of our managerial regime because the deck was stacked. And then at the same time, he brought in multiculturalism because biculturalism was complex in Canada because we also have an Indigenous population. So that's a whole separate topic. So let's just stay focused on the founding groups. So we had the French and the English, and of course, religion came into it. But then, interestingly, there were different minority groups who came in. So I want to keep race out of immigration and just look at the example of the Irish. So without getting too much into the weeds of Northern Ireland and conflicts there, the first wave of Irish immigration, which came into Canada, were predominantly loyalists. So they were Irish Protestants. They weren't Irish Catholics. And even if they were Irish Catholics, they tended to be loyal to the crown. So they might not be the Irish that you think of when you think of Irish, because now I think most people, when they think Irish Catholics. And then there were famines in Ireland. So millions of Irish needed to leave Ireland, and they started mass immigrating into Canada. They were not well received. They were half starved when they arrived. Disease was rampant. They were in a very bad way, and so they were straining resources. I'm just going to find a quote about them. So in the Globe newspaper, there was an editorial where it was written, "Irish beggars are to be met everywhere, and they are as ignorant and vicious as they are poor. They are lazy, improvident, and unthankful. They fill our poorhouses and our prisons and are as brutish in their superstition as Hindus." So they weren't well received, and they, unlike the Irish Protestants, they tended to be seen as cheap labor. They worked very hard on major projects like the Lachine Canal, for example, and thousands died from disease or working in construction in different ways. So all of this is to say that with taking race completely out of it, we have people who had a lot of commonalities. If we would compare, let's say, the Irish, the Scots, the English, and the Welsh of today versus those people and, Saudis, obviously they shared a lot more culturally than different groups that we're bringing in today. So did they just all arrive kumbaya? What happened with the Irish? Well, you might find it interesting to learn, or you may already know this, that there was no St. Paddy's Day parade in Toronto for 100 years until the 1980s. So from the 1880s to the 1980s, it was canceled because there were conflicts within the Irish. There were the Irish Protestants and there were the Irish Catholics. There were Irish separatists and nationalists. There were the Fenians. There were the Fenian raids in Canada, where Irish the Irish who wanted the British out invaded Canada at a certain point. And one of the first war memorials in Canada, one at a university, I think it was U of T, was devoted to students who had died fighting against these Fenian raiders. But anyway, going back to St. Paddy's Day. So the St. Paddy's Day parade in Toronto was canceled for 100 years because there was so much violence at the St. Patrick's Day parade. So there were the St. Patrick's Day Irish Catholics who were poor, less educated, and tended to be laborers, versus the Irish Protestants who were Crown Loyalists, who tended to be farmers and were more powerful. They wanted to distance themselves from the peasant Irish, if you will. And so they had made these orange, I can't remember what it was called, but like an orange organization that echoed an organization in Northern Ireland. And it was almost like a secret society, but I guess it wasn't really secret. It was like a society, I guess, a club. And the Irish who were in this club were considered, politically saleable and had good connections. And the Irish Catholics were not welcome in these society clubs. So the orange folks would have their parade, and there would inevitably be violence, and then the Irish Catholics would have theirs. So these tensions escalated to the point where a Canadian politician, one of the fathers of Confederation, who had originally been an Irish nationalist, became a Crown Loyalist, and he ended up being assassinated. So I just wanted to point all this out, not because I want to bore you, but A, because Canadian history is really interesting, and B, because it's being rewritten with platitudes in order to advance a globalist and anti-Canadian agenda. And one of the ways is by lying and saying that Canadians didn't have any hiccups, and that everybody was just kumbaya and things were working so well for 150 years. Multiculturalism is so wonderful. That is just a lie. Even amongst people who shared a lot of values, it was a long road with a lot of bloodshed and a lot of conflict. We had a conscription crisis with Quebec during the First World War because they were not loyal to the Crown, and we had to go and fight in the First World War as part of the British Commonwealth. We had terrorist separatist movements in the 1970s, the October Crisis, and I think it was 1971. We have had a federal party committed to separation in Canada for as long as I can remember. I grew up partly in Quebec, and when I was a child in elementary school, the riot police were called because tensions were so high and hostilities were so great towards Anglophones at that time that high school students marched on our school, rioted, threw rocks through the window. We were rushed into the middle of the school, and we were not permitted to leave. Our parents had to come and pick us up. So this idea that it's all just being wonderful is a pipe dream. So now when you think about the hundreds of years and the bloodshed and the wars and the tremendous amount of concessions that were made from the people who founded Canada in order to make it a functioning country, and then you think of this egotistical sociopath, commie, becoming the prime minister and just imposing multiculturalism on us and assuming that it's all just going to work out is really just sabotage. It really is just sabotage. And when people are trying to sell you on an argument that it is our country, the country that you live in, is theirs to give away, and that you don't matter any more than someone from another country, you really need to shut that down. 20 years ago, when I used to have this discussion with people, and bear in mind, I have very high trait openness. I'm really interested in other places. I've lived elsewhere outside of Canada. I've traveled, well, not as an adult though. I've traveled fairly broadly. I've been to 5 continents. I love learning other languages. I'm not very good at it, but I try. I love trying different foods. I've been into every major religion's houses of worship because I like to learn about other faiths, even though I am a Christian myself. I really enjoy traveling and learning about history, other cultures, what works, what doesn't. So I'm not a closed-minded person. I've had a lot of exposure. I've lived in different provinces. I know how different the culture is within different Canadian regions, not only in other parts of the world. So I don't take for granted that it's just easy, and that especially when Canadians have basically surrendered our own culture, given up on our history, rewritten it, permitted it to be rewritten by odious people who have taught our children that we've had no heroes, that white people are bad people, that people who work together, because there was tremendous amount of cooperation amongst Indigenous and the settlers, because it was mutually beneficial. So we have this rewriting of our history where white settlers oppressed everybody else 24 hours a day, and men oppressed women. There was no cooperation amongst families, and it's such a lie. So I'm going to circle back. So there is the argument. There's the cultural argument, which I think I've discussed, and then there's the economic argument, which I went into. Then we have the social argument, this guilt trip argument that Canadians are obligated to bring in desperate and needy people. So 20 years ago, I think, to harken back to what I was saying before, or circle back, I used to say to people, do you have a door? They'd say yes. Say, do you lock it? They'd say yes. And I'd say, okay, this discussion's over. We just had the immigration discussion. And they used to find it incredibly arrogant and obtuse, and I thought it was funny, and I probably heard it from someone else, I don't know who, thought it was amusing. But it really is an important argument, and that's all it boils down to. There are currently 41 million people in Canada. About 36, let's say, million of them are actual Canadians. Then we have a contingent of foreigners. There are a lot of Canadians in need. I see Canadians almost on a daily basis who are homeless, who are in a bad way, and they could really use some help. I don't bring them into my home. My obligation is to my family, and I have a door, I lock it, and people who come into my home are there for a reason. And I feel exactly the same way about our borders. People who come into Canada, I could be, and I'm not completely, like, my belief is that we need a complete moratorium on immigration now. We need remigration. We need mass deportations. We need to work very hard on restoring Canadian culture. And we need to root out the rot in our institutions. Every institution in this country has been ideologically captured by nefarious actors. So we have a lot of work to do. Once that's done, and once we've reestablished our and rebuilt our country, then I think an argument could be made for small numbers of exceptional people to be brought into Canada, because I'm not the argument of innovation and bringing in people who are exceptional is not an argument that's lost on me. I believe in excellence, and I can be persuaded that there is a person, a 1 in a million person, who could do so much good, who transcends, culture and their cultural hangups, and would integrate well and would offer a lot to Canada. I think that person should be permitted to come into Canada once the conditions that I described before are met. However, that person is 1 in a million. So when we're looking at the number of people who are alive right now, that exceptional individual would amount to 7,000 people total. If Canada brought every exceptional person into our country, it would be a drop in the bucket of the numbers of people that we're bringing in. A drop in the bucket. So this idea to bring it back to H-1B, that program is for exceptional talents, it isn't. There are, kind of middle white collar worker positions. There are blue collar worker positions that require no training. I had heard that there were even requests for interns. Interns aren't even trained. So if you're going to lie to people and tell them that program is to bring in people who are exceptional, because even though there are over 300 million Americans are so stupid and useless now that they can't innovate or do their own jobs. That's a really hard argument to make when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. It just doesn't make sense at all. It isn't a persuasive argument, and I think that people are right to be defensive about it. So I've covered a lot. I've spoken for a long time. I'm getting intellectually burnt out. But I wanted to talk about some solutions, because it is fine to point out the problems, and it's important to know what they are, to actually address them, which most of our politicians don't do. Most of our thought leaders don't do, because they're afraid of offending people. But we also have to talk about solutions to the problems. Do I think that Canada is finished? No. I actually made a post recently urging people to stop blackpilling on my posts, because I wouldn't be putting my face and name out there and devoting so much of my time and energy, which is largely uncompensated, to trying to move the Overton window and educate people and have these important discussions and get people thinking. I wouldn't be doing all of that if I thought that Canada was lost. I'm obviously fighting for the country. I think it's worth fighting for. So what can we do? The first and number one most important thing is for people to have actual real world conversations. It's wonderful if you want to repost this, or if you want to take this video, make it into more palatable, smaller portions that are easier for people to digest. I don't have that kind of time. Go to it. I would welcome it. Just please give me credit for my own words. That would be a good contribution. But the best thing is to have hard conversations with people around you. I've had this immigration discussion with so many visible minorities, and every single person that I've spoken with over time has agreed with me. And I think it's entirely possible to have to make a strong case that other people agree with. People want to live in a functioning society. They don't want to have high crime rates. They don't want to have radical Islamists in our streets every day, harassing Jews and Christians and anybody who disagrees with them. We don't want to have our institutions being overrun by foreign interference. but we have to tell the truth. We need strong leadership. So everyday conversations with people that you know, hard conversations is a solution. And then lobbying our politicians. I can't believe that people behave. It's like they have Stockholm syndrome, as though the same incrementalists who presided over um, very little gains are their best friends. We have the conservatives who have sold out children with Bill C4, which is an abomination of a bill, which is an attack on parental rights and reality itself when it's framed as detrimental to children to affirm the sex that they are born as. That according to this bill, that is considered conversion therapy to raise your own child in the sex that they're born as. Because if the child is unwell and thinks that they're the opposite sex, it is now considered conversion therapy, according to this bill, to instruct them properly. And medical professionals can be penalized, obviously, if they don't go along with this insane inversion of reality and attack on children. And religious leaders can be persecuted for instructing children properly. So it's a very dangerous bill. And the conservatives unanimously went along with this. And in fact, some of them cried and hugged afterwards. They were so excited about the bill. So when people have Stockholm syndrome and behave as though these absolute empty suits, people who foisted the COVID regime on us and said nothing for 2 years until the biggest working class movement in my lifetime took to the streets the Freedom Convoy. And then you had these duplicitous politicians who stood around and said, we're all in this together, and who argued for more mandates faster, suddenly realized that the political tables had turned and they better get on board. But they still haven't argued for anybody to be held to account for the medical totalitarianism and the tyranny. They gave themselves raises. The wife of the future Prime Minister of Canada wrote on her blog that everybody should stay the F home. I have a screenshot of that. She also very, in a way that shows how much she relates to the average Canadian, said that, it would be nice to consider paying your hired help still a little bit, maybe half their wage, because, a lot of Canadians have hired help. Canadians were worried about their businesses being shut down, their children being taken away from them, and their kids being traumatized and harmed by these insane, draconian, totalitarian rules. But at the top of this woman's list was, what to do. The debate over your staff is just so hard, so tough. So no, I don't have Stockholm syndrome. I will tell you what I told Pierre myself a couple weeks ago. If he starts behaving like a conservative, this is not exactly what I said, but it's along these lines. If he comes out and talks about mass deportation and restoring Canadian culture and Canadian values, then I will support that, because I support the best ideas. I support actual policies that are going to be translated into law. I will support the repeal of horrible laws. I will support absolutely going to war philosophically, calm down, going to war with a managerial regime, getting it and getting these bad actors out of it. And I badly want the conservatives to make these arguments, but they're not making these arguments. They are appealing to people who have Stockholm syndrome, who do not understand that our politicians work for us. They overpromise and underdeliver, and the time to push is now. So another way of taking action is to force the hand of these empty suits before they win the election, because they will win the election, and make them commit to actual policy that they can be held to account for. I think most importantly, though, aside from the heart conversations, we need to really start thinking in terms of our own small communities, because we need a bulwark against the forces that are trying to destroy everything good and beautiful in our lives, our families, our communities, our churches. And that means real life relationships. And that means building communities, strong communities, so that the next time totalitarianism comes down the pipeline, you will not be alone. You will have a strong community that you can rely on. So those are just a few ways. I know other people have much better ideas. My strength is analysis. My strength isn't necessarily coming up with the best ways to combat things, but I did make a list in one of my posts, like 10 things that you can do. So maybe I'll refer back to that myself and refresh myself and my memory and put some thought into it. But anyway, I hope that this long rambling discussion will make you think about some of the ways in which these issues connect. I didn't even have time to touch on the terrorist attacks, but I will say before, as I leave, that I think it's really important for people who are making the economic argument and pretending that magic soil changes people as soon as they enter into a new space, that the Magdeburg terrorist was a doctor. He was highly educated, obviously, and he still went on a rampage. He was allegedly not a Muslim. Some people have said that that's taqiyya. I personally believe it's taqiyya given some of his behavior online. But regardless whether he was Muslim or not Muslim, he did not integrate, did he? He went on a killing spree. Over 200 people are injured. I think 15 died. And then we have the born and bred, just as American as Bobby from Appalachia. What was his name? Let me check. I want to be precise. Okay, sorry, I was wrong. So the Saudi doctor killed 5 people and injured over 200. He also is a refugee. So pay attention to that when people guilt trip you about needy refugees who repay their host country by going on a murderous rampage, and ruining the lives of thousands of people when you think about the number of people who are related to the people who were traumatized for life or murdered. The American, as American as Bobby from Appalachia, his name is fine, upstanding citizen. It was Shamsuddin Jabbar. He killed 15. That's what I got confused. In New Orleans, he injured dozens more, and he was an Army IT expert. So just really contributing there. I don't know how people can make an argument that somebody who joined an institution like the U.S. Army and worked in IT, like the tech bros, born and raised in Texas, if you can't integrate someone like him into society, it's going to be a tough haul for like a toothless guy married to his cousin who was raised to think that women are subhuman. It's going to be tougher. A little more work. Roll up those sleeves if you really want to bring these people in. So you have that, and then I had made some notes about just some of the other recent murderous rampages. Berlin, Christmas market, 13 people were killed. Nice in France, in 2016, 86 people were killed in a truck rampage. So I think that people need to start asking themselves, people who are pro-immigration and who believe in multiculturalism, what exactly is the cost-benefit analysis of the number of nice restaurants with interesting food versus the number of murdered and trafficked and raped girls? What's the cost-benefit analysis of the number of tech experts who are brought in to innovate versus the number of people who are at a Christmas market or walking down the street one minute and are in a body bag the next minute? What exactly is a cost-benefit analysis for you? Because there is a cost. And I'm not sure the benefits are quite as great as people who are pushing these policies are leading us to believe. And then I guess one of the things that I didn't even have a chance to go over, and I just want to go over it quickly because I made notes and I'm a completionist. But Pierre Poilievre, he talked about the best system in the world, and he had said, you can bring your, I'm gonna pause it again and get the quote. Okay, it was, you can bring your traditions, your culture, and your stories, but basically leave your beefs at home. You can bring your traditions, your culture, your stories, your traditions, your culture, and your stories. What is culture, if not traditions, stories? His story, history, our stories. You can bring them in. His argument, he's saying to people, our country is nothing but an economic zone. Come in here, just work, pay your taxes. You can benefit from everything built by other people who existed before, and you can do whatever you want. You can bring your culture in, you bring your stories in. Just don't cause any major beefs. I hope people can understand, based on everything that I've said before, why that is so inadequate and why that is not going to sustain a country. We need to have shared stories. We need to have a shared culture. We need to have a uniting sense of traditions and of an outlook on the world. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody needs to believe the same thing. That doesn't mean that, you can't celebrate Hanukkah if you're Jewish. It doesn't mean that you can't have different places of religious worship in Canada. But it means if they're put on a par with the Christian influence which shaped our country, then we're no longer going to have a country even approximating what Canada is. And so there has to be a hierarchy and there has to be an emphasis on uniting principles. Not you can come in and basically believe whatever you want, do whatever you want, and there will be no consequences to having completely different belief systems. This is not an argument that a leader wants to make or should make or that people should accept. So I hope that some of the, examples that I've come up with will be thought provoking and that you'll have these discussions, at the very least, that, maybe if you completely disagree with me, that it piqued your curiosity on some of the points that I brought up, because my aim is to restore the country. I have an obligation to people children, people who will come after me, to give them the opportunities that I had. That is unfortunately becoming increasingly difficult ask. And I think the primary way that we do this is by restoring our culture. So I hope that you'll join me in that and that we can work together to restore Canada. God bless you.